So this is biology chapter 6, sections 3 and 4. Section 3 is about water and the cool things that water can do because of its chemical properties. So water is a polar molecule, and what does that mean? Um, Water molecules are formed by covalent bonds holding the oxygen to the hydrogen. So it links two hydrogens to an oxygen. Oxygen has a stronger pull for electrons, so like it pulls more of the electrons towards itself when it's sharing the electrons. So because of that, it becomes slightly negative, and the hydrogens consequently get less of the electrons, so they become slightly positive. This creates an unequal sharing of electrons that makes water a polar molecule. And we can see that there. Here's the nucleus of oxygen, the nucleus of hydrogen, and the red are the electrons, and they're each sharing a pair. And see how the hydrogens swing around the edge? It has to do with the unequal sharing. So oxygen is slightly negative, and the hydrogens are slightly positive. Now, water's polarity, so one water molecule is polar. But water molecules are also attracted to other water molecules. And the attraction between them, so here's a water molecule, H2O, here's another H2O, here's another H2O, and another. There is an attraction, see those dotted lines, between the water molecules, okay? And it forms between the hydrogen and the oxygen, or the slightly positive side and the slightly negative side. That bond that forms between them is called a hydrogen bond. And it's a very weak bond, but when there's many of them, it's strong. And hydrogen bonds are between hydrogen and oxygen, or hydrogen and fluorine, or hydrogen and nitrogen. And together, like I said, how about you add this part? Hydrogen bonds in large groups are strong. Mixtures. A mixture is a combination of two or more substances, so put them together, and each substance still retains its individual characteristics and properties. So it doesn't become something else when mixed together. Mixtures can be heterogeneous or homogeneous. First, homogeneous mixtures, when it looks uniform composition, when you're looking at that mixture, it looks uniform throughout, it's homogeneous. A solution, if you were to add sugar to water, you'd make a solution. Or the other day when we did the enzyme lab, I made a yeast solution. Another name for that is homogeneous, so same thing. So there's two things in a solution. There is a solvent, the substance in which another thing is dissolved in. Most of the time, water is the solvent. And living things are mostly water, so water is the thing, the solvent doing the dissolving. The solute then is the substance that is being dissolved, like sugar in water. Heterogeneous mixtures, when the compounds within it are distinct, they're heterogeneous. So they don't really mix too well. Like for example, this solution, blood, for example, blood cells, if you take out your blood and you put it in a tube, it looks like it's all one solution, but over time, the cells will go down to the bottom and they will separate. So a suspension, and blood as an example, is a type of heterogeneous mixture in which the particles settle over time. Another example of heterogeneous mixture is a colloid, and milk is an example of a colloid. Milk protein is separate from the fat. They look mixed, but their milk doesn't mix with the protein, but they don't settle out. So that's a colloid. Acids and bases. So we're going to talk about pH here, the pH scale. So we add solutes, things like sugar or salt, to water. Okay, the reason why things like that dissolve in water has to do because water's polar. The polar water will pull things apart. When you add an acid to water, so here's an acid, you put it in water, it will dissociate or separate, releasing hydrogen ions. And H with a capital or with a plus sign is a hydrogen ion. Anything that does that when you put it in water releases hydrogen ions is an acid. That's the definition of an acid. Substances that release hydroxide ions, OH, when you put them in water, are called bases. And this just shows, okay, you add this yellow molecule attached to a red to water, and it will release yellow, separate yellow from red, releasing hydrogen ions. And then hydroxide ions are released when it's at base. A pH scale measures the amount of hydrogen ions or hydroxide ions in a solution. It determines how strong that acid is or how strong a base is. So a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions, I already hinted at it, is called the pH scale. Here is 7. It goes from 1 to 14, and 7 is neutral. Anything below 7 is an acid. Acids have pH levels below 7. And anything above 7 is a base. Let's just take a look here. Battery acid is the strongest acid with a pH of 0. pH of 1 is like stomach acid. These are examples. So orange juice has a pH of 3. Stomach acid has a pH of 1. Orange juice is a weaker acid. So the arrow goes to the left because it's increasingly acidic this way. Increasingly basic is to the right. So a pH of 14 would be the strongest base, like sodium hydroxide. 13, oven cleaner. Okay, so the strongest base is the biggest number. So pH of 11 would be a weaker base than a pH of 14. And this way there are more hydrogen ions. The closer it gets to 0, the more hydrogen ions are released. And the closer it gets to 14, the more hydroxide ions are released. Living things have these things called buffers. And they help keep pH closer to neutral. To keep strong acids from being strong, make them a weak acid, or take a strong base and make it a weak base. These things are called buffers. Help protect and buffer the pH. Organic chemistry. So this is section 4. Section 3 was about water and pH. Ooh, there goes my lights. Come on. Woo. It's organic chemistry. One of my favorite things to talk about. Organic chemistry is simply the study of organic compounds, and to be organic, they have to contain the element carbon. It's a component of almost all biological molecules. And here's a carbon atom, which we've drawn before. It has 4 electrons in the outer shell. And because of that, carbon needs 4 to be happy. And so it can form 4 bonds on every side. And it usually does, unless it's double bonded with something. So it can form these balls right here represent carbon atoms. So they can be in a chain, they can be a branched molecule, or they can be in a ring. So carbon can do all sorts of shapes. That's why it's called the backbone of organic things like us. Macromolecules are large molecules that are formed by joining smaller molecules together. And there's 4 specific types of macromolecules you can see here: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. The macromolecules, some of them are polymers. A polymer is a fancy word. Poly means many. That are molecules that are made from many repeating units. So the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. And these repeating units are identical or nearly so. And they're called monomers. Mono, single. So I like to think of monomers, you can add this to single Legos. And if you stack them on top of each other, you add more than one Lego, you build a polymer. Carbohydrates are the first type of macromolecule. And here's a picture of glucose, which is a carbohydrate, sucrose, which is a carbohydrate, and glycogen. And they get increasingly more complex the more we go to the right. They contain carbon, C's. They contain hydrogen, H's, and oxygen. And that's all they contain. And the ratio is 1:2 to 1. So for every 1 carbon, there are 2 hydrogen. and 1 oxygen. Why do we need carbohydrates? They are essential for energy in living things. Carbohydrates. Larger carbohydrates, like glycogen, are called a polysaccharide, and they're made by joining these smaller ring structures, like glucose, they're called monosaccharides. Lipids are another type of macromolecules. They are also made of mostly carbon and hydrogen, and they're more branched and into chains rather than rings, and they make up fats, oils, and waxes. And a fat's primary function is to store energy, but they also prevent water loss in plants and form honeycomb and beehives, which is fun. Proteins are another category of macromolecules, and they are made of smaller compounds, so their monomers are called amino acids. So if you put a whole bunch of amino acids together, you make a protein. And so here is a protein. Look at all the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and they also have nitrogen in proteins, so that's something. Let's add that to that. Proteins have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Boom, that's a kicker. And here's the structure of amino acid. Okay, you don't need to know the details of it here, but it has a nitrogen. So a whole bunch of these little things put together builds a protein. There are 20 different amino acids or 20 different Legos to build a protein, and they can be put in different combinations to create the wide variety of proteins that exist in living things. Excuse me, proteins have many diverse roles. They're more diverse than lipids, more diverse than carbohydrates. They are the structure, support in cells. They transport substances between cells, like oxygen. Hemoglobin is a protein. They signal between cells. They speed up chemical reactions. You know this is our enzyme. Make sure you write that in. And they control cell growth, so they have a wide variety of functions. The last type of macromolecule is called a nucleic acid. They store and transmit genetic information. And they're also made of smaller monomers or repeating subunits. And their subunits, they contain oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and then phosphorus. Underline phosphorus. That's what makes nucleic acids different from the other macromolecules. They have phosphorus. And these repeating subunits are called nucleotides. Nucleic acids are in there are two types of nucleic acids in living organisms. The first one you've probably heard of. It's called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. So nucleic acids make the DNA that are in our cells, living thing cells. They also make another form of genetic material called RNA, or ribonucleic acids. We'll talk more about these nucleic acids when we get to the genetics unit. So that's the end of section 6.3 about water and about pH, and about 6.4, which are about the 4 major macromolecules, their structures, what they look like, what elements they contain, and what the small subunits are to make